Self-concept and perception. I think these are two of the most exciting and rich to understand interpersonal communication and interpersonal relationships. If I could only teach two topics in a communication course, I would teach perception and I would teach conflict management. Conflict management because it pulls together every skill that we cover in a class, and that does come at the end of the semester. But perception is critically important because perception runs through everything that we do. And perception is chapter 4. Perception, to give you an idea, perception is how we make sense of reality, right? We take in the world through our 5 senses, making sense, and our brain organizes and we interpret what we believe to be true. And not everybody's is the same, but once we accept something is real, we will behave accordingly. That's why when we go to a movie, we know it's a movie, but when we accept, our brain accepts it as real, we get scared, we get upset, we laugh, because our brains, get into the reality of the film. That's why, but it's faulty because we have our perceptions are based on our past experience. They're based on what we expect, what we want, what we've been trained to look at and interpret, and that's why. Well, a couple of examples. If you get eyewitnesses to a auto accident, my guess is you're going to get multiple interpretations because of when the person looked up. Even if they didn't look up, they'll give an account where they were standing. Were they standing on this corner or on this corner, and they saw it happen? And also, gender and racial bias can come into that as well. So, also, when you're watching a football game, and the call is against your team, we often accuse the the referee of being stupid or being blind or whatever. But when it goes against the opposition, we often are saying, "Great call, great call." So it's perception. That's part of perception as well. But perception is really how we understand the world, and it's very complex. But I want to show you to discuss the relationship between perception and all the other elements of communication. Self-concept, chapter 3. Self-concept is the perception that we have of ourself. How we view who we are and what we accept to be true and false. And what that is, whatever that truth is, that affects how we interact with other people. And I will be coming back to chapter 2 in just a moment. When we talk about language and nonverbal communication, language, the meaning of language is perceived. We don't have concrete meanings of language. People hear words and they have different connotations. Certain cuss words, some people see as rude, some people see as pure exclamation. Some people don't even get it, right? Because they're not exposed to it. But nonverbal communication is how we perceive people's actions, which is why somebody making direct eye contact may be perceived as, hi, I want to talk to you. Another person might see it as flirtatious. Another person might see it as anger. And so these are perceptual issues. When we talk about listening, listening is the perception of messages. And when we get into conflict involves perceived differences. And so perception pervades everything. And so whatever you learn about perception in chapter 4 holds true throughout all of the chapters. And it's important to get a grip on what all that is. Now, that being said, let's go back to chapter 3 on Self-concept, all right? We are not born with a self-concept. We are born with personality traits, and those personality traits can affect our self-concept, but the bottom line is that we are not born with a self-concept. That is something that is learned, and it is learned through communication. It starts with our first caregivers, typically a parent, a mom or a dad. It could be a foster parent. It could be an older sibling. But our first trusting relationships, that's where we start getting a sense of self. And we used to think that by the time we were 3 years old, we had a solid sense of who we were in terms of being loved, being likable, and that we can trust other people. Now we're thinking it's as early as 18 months. So those very, very early days, starting with day one, we start to help foster our children's self-concept. So very important. So self-concept is learned, and we learn it through multiple ways. And the book is very good about explaining that. There's biological and personality issues. We also learn it through, excuse me, social comparison, which is how we compare ourselves to others. Also reflected appraisal, which is how do we think other people think of us? In other words, what do you think your best friend thinks of you? That's reflected appraisal. And then, of course, there's culture and gender roles that affects how we perceive ourselves. So what's critical in all of this is how I see myself, how you see yourself. We want to have a life that fulfills who we think we are. And so if we have a positive sense of self, we're only going to, we're going to be more, we're going to be choosy. We're going to be more choosy about what we let into our lives, the people that we accept or don't accept, the type of behavior that these people put toward us. People with low self-concepts are less choosy. There's that kind of phenomenon of, I'm lucky that anybody likes me, right? And so that's so important to understand, right? About yourself. I have to know who I am. You need to know who you are in order to be able to be, fit into the best relationship, so that I can maximize myself. My partner can maximize him or herself. And when I say partner, I mean anything from family member to a life partner. I'm saying partner in the sense of with whom you have the relationship. If we don't know, we can get caught up with relationships that really are unhealthy for us. So we need to know who we are, because we seek out who we think will treat us the way we should be treated, right? That means we seek out people that we think will treat us well or appropriately, and we reject those who we think would treat us inappropriately. And depending on what type of self-concept you have, that's a whole different answer. For example, if I think I have a very low sense of self and I think I'm lucky that somebody likes me, then I'm going to be more likely to put up with all kinds of behavior because I don't want to lose a person, right? And it could be that I might interpret it as, wow, I guess I deserve that. I'm not a very good person. Whereas meeting the same person with a positive self-concept, I'd be saying, look, out of here. I'm not going to put up with that. So that's a dynamic. We like to look at the other person more often because it's easier on us, but we do have to look at ourselves because we can't connect to the most advantage for us in terms of self-fulfillment if we don't. All right. So self-concept is huge. Now I would like to move into chapter 4, perception. Perception, I've already spoken about that, how it's the overriding process. While self-concept is my perception of myself, Your perception of me is your perception of me. Okay, so they're separate. Self-concept is specifically about the self. Perception is about everything. You know, how we perceive the weather, how we perceive other people, how we perceive circumstances, anything. Perception is tricky, but our brains hold on to what we perceive because that's a reality. And we don't like to not know. You know, we'll believe false information if it gives us a sense of continuity. You know, we want to have a sense of what's going on. We like to know, and that's a problem because sometimes we jump to false conclusions, and it can cause us real problems. So, racism is like that. We hear, you know, racism is passed down from generation to generation simply because it's a quick way to learn how to deal with people. If I'm supposed to be racist against a certain person, then I know I can leave them alone, right? And that's totally detrimental, and it's a shame because all people have some levels of that. But getting back to perception in general and how it relates to interpersonal communication. We take in the world through our senses, right? And so if our senses are debilitated in any way, it affects what we bring in, right? And so, you know, I'm just getting over a cold and my sense of smell has been all messed up, and my sense of hearing as well, because my ears and sinuses were infected. And so I wasn't picking up on things, and a couple people were getting impatient because I misunderstood them, because I couldn't hear, and also, you know, somebody was cooking a dinner for me and said, how do you like it? Well, doesn't it smell great? And I had to say, I can't smell it. And it was unfortunate because it affected how my taste. So we take in the world and we choose. We have hundreds of thousands of bits of information coming to us. We have to choose, and that's the selection process. We choose. Am I going to pay attention? You know, you're in the classroom. Am I going to pay attention to what the teacher is saying, or the thought that's going on in my head, or am I going to pay attention to the air filter or the air vent up on the ceiling? Am I going to pay attention to the whispering going on to the side of me? We have to choose. Excuse me. We need to choose, and once we choose, then that's a selection. Then we organize it into some sort of shape that our brain will recognize. And then we attach meaning to it, right? So let's say I'm trying to find my friend on campus. And I know that she carries a red backpack. She has long, wavy, dark hair, and typically is wearing jeans. Right? And so in the back of my mind all day, because I know I want to find her, I'm seeing people and trying to find her. And I see walking away from me, there's that person with the red backpack, long wavy hair, and jeans. And so I'm going, my God, there's my friend. And I run up to the person and I put my hand on the shoulder. The person turns around and bam, it's not that person. Completely different person. And when I stand back, I'm saying, of course that's not my friend. This person's a little heavier. Person is wearing shoes that my friend normally doesn't wear. Why didn't I see that? Why didn't I see that? Because my brain wanted to see my friend. And so selection is affected by many things: what we expect, what we want, what we're trained to look at for, etc. Okay? So I was looking for my friend, saw my friend, what I thought was my friend, and those signals indicated to me it was my friend. I was wrong. I could have been right, but I was wrong. And up until the moment the person turned around and I realized it's my friend, not my friend, I was convinced that's who it was. Because if there had come a time where I realized that's not my friend, I would have stopped my actions, right? So once we decide something is real, it's real until proven differently. Children, maybe you, Do you ever have a monster under the bed or in the closet, right? Or in the backyard? And your parents would say, no, 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 there's nothing there. And you'd be saying, yes, yes, there is. And to you, that ghost or that monster or the alien that was under that bed or in the closet or out in the backyard, that was real. And you cried and you were afraid. You had a real physical reaction to it. And then at some point, either you discovered it or somebody pointed it out, and it was not an issue anymore. Okay, so some things that affect perception. Age, simply because we've experienced more. Or as we age, our brain changes. As we're children, our brains are still maturing. Our brains don't mature until we're in our mid-20s now, that we now understand. But also, height, weight. I was on a flight recently, and it was on Southwest. And in Southwest, you pick your own seats based on, when you get in line. And the seats, first the window seats and the aisle seats fill typically. And what's left for the later people are aisle seats. And there was this man who was obese, and he was having to find a place to sit. And he kept saying to the flight attendant that, hey, there's no seats for me. There's no seats for me. And she kept saying, there must be, 30 seats available, but they're all in the center. And he said, there's no seats for me. And she was getting very irritated, the flight attendant. And he finally said, a seat for me needs to be in the aisle because of my size. And so in looking down the rows of seats, in his mind there were no seats for him because of his weight, okay, and his size. So age, weight, height, right? Height can make a difference in how you perceive the world. Gender roles, being male or female, your religious background, any of the cultures you belong to can affect how you perceive things, because you'll select things differently, you will interpret things differently, therefore you will respond. And respond means communicate or act in some other way. Okay, so why is this important to know in terms of relationships? Well, for one thing, part of perception is stereotyping. And when we stereotype, we may overlook negative things in a person. We may overlook positive things in a person. We may not deal at all with an individual because of stereotypes. And stereotypes are, an individual characteristic that we apply to an entire group of like individuals. And we know that that just isn't true. But our brain has to make a decision on what's real and what isn't. And so very often we will stereotype, not necessarily to be intentionally bad, but they often are very false. All of us stereotype because we can't know everything about everybody. And so we stereotype because we want to know. But in relationships, on day-to-day relationships, we will misperceive people's actions. And it's, hey, I texted you. It's been 3 hours. Why the heck haven't you responded to me? I don't like being ignored. Why are you ignoring me? And the person texts back, because I was in a meeting all afternoon. And then your response is, oops, never mind. Well, remember back in chapter 1, you can't take back what you say. You can only modify it, right? And so we have to be very, very careful that we don't jump to conclusions. And by the way that we don't jump to conclusions is you've got to first separate fact from inference. What do I know? And what's opinion? Or what are my things are just I'm making up? So gosh, I texted you, that I know, and I know that I haven't received a response. But wow, that's all I know. And so if I'm getting upset because I've inferred that you are ignoring me, that causes some problems, doesn't it? And so we have to step back and say, what do I know? Wow, I texted, I haven't received a response. Well, what are some possibilities? Maybe the person didn't get the text. Maybe the phone is off. Maybe he or she left the phone at their house today, and so it never got to work with them. Or maybe didn't even get the text. Maybe you haven't received the text yet. I've sent emails that took 48 hours for the people to receive because the server was so stinking slow. So, technology isn't perfect. Or it could be that the person was having a problem of some kind and couldn't get to you, or was simply out of range for the cell phone. And so when we pull back and say, okay, there's more than one way of looking at that, it's called perception checking. And so instead of going after the person saying, why didn't you text me? You're ignoring me. I hate that, blah, 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 blah. It would be maybe you'd send another text of, hey, I sent a text and I haven't heard back from you. Did you get my text? Did you, have you been tied up for the day? What's up? Right? Takes a lot more words, but it can save a potential fight, right? Or a potential mistake. And so perception checking is the biggest skill that comes out of the chapter on perception. And there's a whole separate tape on that skill, but that is your first competency. In situations that matter, and we haven't talked much about that yet. In fact, we haven't talked at all about it. In situations that matter, a situation that matters is when the people involved risk harm, physical, emotional, psychological harm. And so while we don't perception check everything, and we can't perception check everything, you'd never get out of bed in the morning. If there's a threat of trust, if there's a threat of physical harm, if there's, if it could be psychological harm, then, we need to stop and make that perception check. What do we know for a fact? What are the inferences? And, a lot of us might do this naturally, but you know what? There's a lot of times when we don't, because we rely on partial information to move forward in our day. And so we all perceive constantly, and we all inherently misperceive. And so we have to check, all right? It's a very important skill in relationships. And I have a separate tape just on the skill. And if you have additional questions, let me know and I'll answer them. But that's the overview of self-concept and perception. Perhaps the most important information to remember because it carries through everything that we do. All right? Talk to you later.